Finance podcast from Bottomline Technologies.
Hi, everyone, and thanks for tuning in to our discussion about managing AP amidst COVID-19. My name is Andrea Eaton, VP Solutions Marketing and Sales Enablement at Bottomline Technologies, and I'll be moderating today's conversation between myself and two of my colleagues who I'll let introduce themselves.
Thanks, Andrea. This is Eric Morgan. I'm Bottomline's EVP and Global Controller, and in that role, I have oversight over Bottomline's accounting operations worldwide.
Hi, Andrea. This is Bill Wardwell. I'm the SVP of Strategy and Product. I have oversight for teams that are focused on developing payment automation and AP automation solutions.
Thanks, Eric and Bill. Looking forward to our discussion today. So President Trump declared a state of emergency on March 13, and a month later, today it's April 15th. We still don't know for sure when businesses will reopen on a widespread basis, and what that new normal will look like when they do. And most organizations have long had business continuity plans in place, but this pandemic is definitely forcing them to execute against them, and has potentially uncovered some areas that no one would have thought to consider even with the best laid plans. Bottomline is actually part of a Treasury coalition along with some other providers in our space and corporate Treasury consulting group, Strategic Treasurer. Together, we've been surveying finance and Treasury professionals about how this evolving situation is impacting them. Just a few data points to share with our listeners and help frame this discussion. When we asked about work from home related challenges in week one of our survey, the biggest issue reported by Treasury was concern over the completeness of BCP plans and whether they truly addressed the move to work from home and required adaptation of processes. Fast forward to week 3 of the survey, and the largest concerns reported were more team members working remotely now than a few weeks ago, and just ensuring necessary access to all technology applications for those employees. This survey has also showed us that a third of organizations have had to delay their payables. Only 2% have been able to speed up payments to key suppliers, and that there's negative outlooks for liquidity on receivables. So definitely challenges across both the AP and AR sides of the house. So moving into our discussion today, a question to both of you, and we'll start with Eric. If you consider the pandemic's impact on businesses' financial operations, could you share any just general observations you've made, maybe even that have been surprising or eye-opening to you?
Sure. Thanks, Andrea. Well, I think as business continuity planning goes, and I guess I'll speak for myself and the oversight I have across the global accounting team, this circumstance certainly, far exceeds any contingency plan, a continuity plan we would have normally rehearsed for. The scope, the magnitude, every office, every division, everyone at home for a persistent period of time with really no way to gauge how long that will last. So I think as we looked at this internally at Bottomline, we announced a global work from home requirement on March 13th, which I think was generally in the same proximate period in which many corporations in the U.S. were taking similar moves. Our first requirement was to sort of get the team operational, make sure they had the assets they needed to work from home, the ability to fully function as a team that, and we're talking about a team that historically would have been an in-office team worldwide, not a work from home in any real sense historically. Putting that entire team into a work from home model, getting that team up and running and operational, if you will, and just being able to sustain financial operations really with the magnitude of challenges all of this has created was our first focus and our predominant challenge. I think with respect to our global team, within about a week to a week and a half, we were in a very highly effective operationalized state. And I would say outside of the unusualness of how we're now working in terms of effectiveness, I think we're quite effective. I think we're covering all major areas of financial operations, inbound cash, outbound cash. So I feel very pleased with our response to that. But again, I would say just the scope of this is, I suspect this is true for many companies, far outside of what they normally would have planned for.
Thanks, Eric. Bill, any observations that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I would. I think, what Eric touched on and the scope of what organizations have had to deal with within their financial operations is obviously, very large and very disruptive. And, as we talk to customers, one of the things that I, really observe and is great to see is really the resiliency and the creativity of the teams that are managing all the financial processes that go into accounting, accounts payable, accounts receivable. And, we're really seeing companies step up, their communication with their key partners. So working with suppliers to make sure they have the most up-to-date procedures on how to submit invoices electronically, how to get payments sent electronically so that both their organization can operate effectively, but also that their suppliers and partners can bill them and receive payments in a timely manner. I think the other thing that we, continue to see within this, pandemic is organizations, really looking to work with partners, such as like a Bottom Line Technologies to understand where technology can help in various situations, whether that is making sure they have the best access to invoice data, payment data, or they're using the most up-to-date tools to help them to be able to accelerate and efficiently manage payments. So I think in general, what we're seeing, like I said, is like organizations are adapting to this, they're resilient, but they're also being really open and, communicating and partnering with organizations that they do business with, either from a supply chain perspective or from a technology perspective.
Thanks, Bill. And Eric, Bill touched on electronic invoice and payment processing. Could you share a little bit about what your AP process looked like, on the best of days pre-pandemic?
Yeah, sure. So we've certainly always had a bias within the group, within Bottom Line, of course, to be embracing electronic payments and electronic document management wherever we could, and using sort of the U.S. operations as a surrogate. 85 to 90% of our outbound payments are either made electronically or outsourced check print models. It's a very small minority of payments that we actually physically cut a check in any office location. There's some point of need stuff always. I don't know that you ever get that to zero, but it's really a very, very small component of how we would operate in a normal day-to-day. So, again, I think part of that just comes into our psychology, given what Bottom Line does, and we've always tried to leverage our own solutions end-to-end wherever we could. And be sort of a showcase for that in terms of their efficiency, their scalability. So I think in a normal day-to-day, we're a relatively small accounts payable team across North America. It's only 4 people, and we can scale that team very, very nicely in a normal day-to-day just through the deployment of technology. So prior to this, I would have said that everything just sort of works as it should. This generally some resistance across some spectrum of vendors relative to electronic payments, but I think we work on that just as a normal approach to try to break down those barriers. And perversely, I think this opportunity, this work from home opportunity, has put vendors in a circumstance where if they were getting a physical check, they're really unable to process that and they would have historically. And I think it's an opportunity for us to continue to demonstrate the ability of electronic payments to solve a real business need, not only in this moment, but hopefully beyond this moment, when parties that may not have been being paid that way really can step back and evaluate how efficient that process is. Again, not just in this moment, but in an ongoing type review.
Sure, that makes total sense. And if you think about your pre-pandemic AP process, it sounds like it was highly electronic, and that probably, positioned you fairly well to transition to, the way that you're working now. But I'm assuming that there have been, some challenges or adjustments for your team along the way, or maybe this has highlighted some areas of the process that maybe you have opportunity for further improvements. Could you talk about that a little bit, Eric?
I said the 85 to 90%, and just to be clear on that metric, that's a combination of electronic payments, which would be the substantial majority of that percentage, as well as outsourced checks. So there still is a physical check involved in some of those metrics, but those are not processed within Bottom Line. They're outsourced to a check print vendor. and that's just part of an outsourced solution, which is, again, very scalable and very efficient. You know, that if you say that 10% remaining, even though it's a small percentage, that's still real work. That's historically been people putting hands on a document, hands on a check, signing a check. So we've not been able to take that, even in this environment, to 0%. There's still some, some requirement periodically to have to make physical payments. What we've done as a response certainly is reduce the number of, we historically we would have done a weekly check run. We've actually gone to every other week at this point, and that might get that might even get elongated further. So we've really had to use this as an opportunity to challenge even that 10% and to work with vendors, express to them what they were already seeing and feeling, the inability to put people in an office or to send people in to sign checks or print checks. There's just a reality to that given our current circumstance. And since we're all going through it, that resonates with people. So our experience as we've worked through these last 4 weeks really is that vendors are very receptive to that feedback and want to understand what they can do to help get themselves paid more quickly, not have things delayed. At this point, I think every organization is focused on cash and sustaining cash flow. So part of this certainly challenge that we're faced with now provides a little bit more natural discussion to try to automate processes that may up until now not have been automated.
Certainly. Yeah, and that vendor perspective is important, and it's great to hear that, there's been understanding amongst the supplier community and willingness to work together to find solutions that keep payment processes running as smoothly as possible. Let's talk for a minute about each of your teams. You're both leaders of teams, one that is responsible for a business's financial operations and another that builds solutions to help those teams do their jobs more easily. Eric, as you think about making your team's lives easier now and potentially when things return to normal, what measures do you expect you might take to do that?
Well, it's an interesting question as well. I think in terms of what we've done so far, and I say so far really essentially a month into a remote work model, I think we've done what we can do relative to equipping our team with what they need to work successfully in this environment. As I look to long term, and I don't even know, and I suspect this is a common viewpoint, I don't even know at this point what a return to normal looks like. I'm not sure that the normal that we're going to enter into as a next phase is actually going to resemble what normal was 60 days ago. So I suspect we're going to be in a protracted period of some degree of remote work and working from home. And I think even when people start to return to an office environment, that's likely to happen in stages. Each decision made based on an individual's comfort level or a corporate entity's comfort level. And I think that will happen differently for different companies. So, my goal is unchanged. It's unchanged now as it would have been 60 days ago. The goal I've always had, and I think most people in my role would be to have operations that are as efficient, as cost effective, and as scalable as possible. And with the technology as it exists today, that's typically the lever that can bring great scalability. One of the things we say all the time, even when we deploy new technology, we very, very rarely, I would never say never, but we very, very rarely deploy technology solutions with an eye toward reducing headcount. What we deploy are solutions that help us minimize the need for ongoing headcount additions, that we can continue to scale as an existing team very efficiently. So that to me is the always goal, and that has not changed.
Thanks, Eric. And Bill, as you hear Eric talk about things like cost effectiveness, efficiency, and scalability being goals of his, how are you and your team thinking about helping customers through this time and even after?
Yeah, there's a couple of key areas that we're really focused on with helping our customers to hit on the areas that Eric just mentioned. I mean, first and foremost right now is we're really trying to be front and center and to be there to meet, talk, and communicate with customers to make sure that they're leveraging the technologies that they have in the best possible ways. It's really amazing to work with customers and see that there are areas where even existing solutions that they've deployed, they haven't, maybe used them to the fullest. And so, talking to customers about, different ways that they can leverage reporting, different ways that they can leverage tools that are in the cloud that help with collaboration with their suppliers. Also working with them to make sure they understand the products and services that we can bring to bear to help them with their suppliers and, do some of the things that Eric mentioned earlier on, like help move suppliers to electronic payments. The other thing that we're, continuing to do also, and not trying to do this through a sales lens, but to work with customers to make sure they know what other options are available for them to potentially leverage new technologies. Eric mentioned, sort of the last mile of payment automation as far as, there's certain entities, whether they're, consumers or small businesses that have been hesitant over time to move to electronic, in particular electronic payments, and there's solutions out there that can help customers. And I think that, we're hearing more and more, and we're talking more and more to customers about different ways that they can pay those type of organizations in different manners than they had previously. And so, we're really just focused on educating, being there for customers, understanding their pain points, and then seeing where we can bring technology to the table and help them.
Great. And if you think about, what are the most important process changes for finance and accounting teams right now? If you had to pick one or two, what would you say?
To me, it's fairly simple. It's digital, right? I mean, most organizations really need to be focused on how do they get to more digital and electronic invoices, purchase orders, and payments. And, a lot of organizations, like Eric mentioned what he's done with his team, have embraced that concept and have made progress in, moving to digital or electronic. But I still think that is by and large the area where most organizations really need to continue to be focused on, and working really collaboratively with other entities in their supply chain to help make that progression to digital. If you think about all the challenges that come with working from home or working in a remote environment or operating on a mobile device or not being able to get into an office, if you're operating in a manner where an invoice is digital or a payment is digital, that process gets a lot easier, right? And it gets a lot easier whether you're in the office or out of the office. And so, I mean, it's a simple view of it, but it's really the right view. Just focus on technology that will help you get to digital and electronic. And I think, organizations also need to be thinking about it, through the lens of it's a great process change for them, but it's a really great process change for their supplier community too. And Andrew, you mentioned, earlier some of the data that was gleaned from a survey about what organizations are, seeing for pain points, and it talks about, problems with receivables and the ability to apply cash. And, organizations are really focused not only on, operating their financial processes really well, but their key partners that are integrated into their supply chain, they want them to be able to operate well too. And, moving to digital, helps all parties in those transactions.
If I could just add one thing there, I thought that was a great answer by Bill, but I want to go back to one thing I said at the beginning of this call, that at least in respect of how I might have looked at contingency plans, I'll just speak for myself, how I might have looked at contingency planning across Bottom Line's global accounting operations, and that this event, this challenge would certainly be well outside of anything I might have planned for. That's all changed now, and I think that's going to change across global commerce. Everyone now that does contingency planning will plan another event like this. You're almost negligent if you don't. So even though the focus of the last several weeks, I suspect in most companies, has just been focused on the basic of basics, keeping employees safe, keeping employees healthy, and trying to get operational in a remote work model. Ultimately, all of these experiences will bleed back through business continuity plans for companies all over the world. And companies are taking note of where they're struggling right now in this environment, and the new wave of business continuity planning will absolutely plan for an event such as this again. So again, I think there's a natural dialogue that just emerges from that as companies look at stress points in the financial flow cycle, be it documents, payments, whatever it is, I think that's just going to be a natural thing that companies focus more attention on.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Eric. Really well said. And if you think, about your team, and if you hadn't, implemented the automation that you have, and if your payment process wasn't, 80–90% electronic today, and you were in the position of a customer, that Bill's team is trying to help and potentially looking at implementing technology, do you think it would be feasible for you to do that right now in this environment?
My answer to that is it depends. Certainly, in a light touch deployment, and I'm obviously familiar with, bottom line products broadly. So certainly, one of the payment solutions we use, actually, it's the majority of our payments in North America is Paymode, and I'm familiar with how Paymode gets implemented and how payers and vendors get onboarded. And certainly we could do that. We could do that, I think, very, very effectively. That's a light touch implementation. It can be done telephonically, working with people. So certainly a deployment of that type of technology, light touch, quick, up and running, highly effective, I would have no hesitation on whatsoever. Different types of technologies that might be more integrated with an overall ERP system that would involve more complicated integrations or even configurations. I think in the current environment, that would be somewhat more challenging, probably substantially more challenging. So I'd probably pause on that. But certainly a light touch deployment that got you up and running on critical, financial operations, I think absolutely if we had to do that, we would be doing that. We would really have no other option. So that would be how I view that.
That makes sense. And, Bill, as you hear Eric mention things like a light touch deployment and you think about, technology broadly and would be consulting with companies that are potentially evaluating technology, what is your advice to teams that need to implement a solution now, and what should they look for specifically?
Yeah, Eric hit on some really great points, right? In the perspective of, how do you look at bringing these technologies into the mix in an environment like this. And I know for myself and, my teams who are working with customers and developing new products, one of the, things that we've, historically been focused on, continue to be focused on, and will be in the future is, really looking at how do we make all of these different technologies a lighter touch implementation and to do the things that Eric mentioned. And, I break it down into a couple of key areas when we think about implementing new technology. One is the process of doing that. And, really in today's day and age, and has been even before this, pandemic, a lot of process associated with implementing new technology, whether it's, a project kickoff or recurring planning meetings or testing and training, that's been happening remote in most cases. A lot of the customers that we work with, a vast majority, we do a lot of that work with them remotely and have been leveraging technologies to do that for quite some time. And then I think the other, dynamic, and it gets to that lighter touch again from Eric's perspective, is, the products that you're leveraging and making sure that they are intuitive to use, so that, as they get deployed to people within your financial operations, it's easy for them to understand, it's easy for them to navigate, cuts down on training, cuts down on, kind of change disruption, if you will, about leveraging new technology. The other piece is around, integration to ERPs, and, Eric, talked about that. In some cases, technology can, require a lift from an ERP integration standpoint, but we're also seeing shifts in some of those approaches, and we also provide some capabilities to make that a lighter touch with more cloud-based and API-based technology to integrate with ERPs, which can help customers adopt payments or invoicing solutions more easily. And then I think the other piece, and Eric touched on it a little bit about supplier enrollment or vendor enrollment services, is also understanding that a lot of these technology solutions come come with support services that will help you with that transition and help your suppliers with that transition around engaging them, educating them, bringing them onto these platforms so that you not only have a great, product and set of technology to leverage, but you have a team usually of really good people who will work with you to not only help educate your teams, but also your suppliers as you kind of make this change in process.
Thanks, Bill and Eric. Some great insight from both of you into how AP automation technology can be implemented even now and the support that's available to companies that are looking to do that. Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about security. Eric, you mentioned earlier cost effectiveness, efficiency, and scalability as being key benefits of technology that you implement, but more and more we're hearing from customers and reading in the news that fraudsters are really trying to take advantage of the current situation and fraud attempts are on the rise. Is this something that your AP team is experiencing, Eric? And if so, what are you doing about it?
Yeah, great question. So across the global accounting team, I think we've always had a very foundational level awareness of fraud and the risk of fraud, certainly given our familiarity with payments products, just what we do for customers and some of the reasons, and as I just know this through my history at Bottom Line, where we might get called into a customer account that could have been a payment problem or some type of fraud, and companies are looking to make that process more secure. So I think our team has always had a heightened awareness of that. One phrase we use sort of cliche periodically is criminals don't take days off. So, there are bad actors will try to exploit any opening. And this, unfortunately, is the circumstance we find ourselves in, where everyone is working much more regularly through email without the benefit of face-to-face or even, in some cases, even telephonic conversations, puts everything into a different risk profile, in my view. So, phishing attempts, social engineering attempts to divert funds through email. I think those have been areas of exposure for many years. I think that's a heightened area of exposure in the current climate. We use a number of tools, technology tools within Bottom Line, focused on security. I won't go into any great depth on those, but what we've just tried to reinforce across all of our teams is don't rely on an email. We have decentralized accounting operations across our worldwide business units, but we've got a very, very narrow concentration of individuals who can actually release funds or sign a check. So we just try to get back to basics in that environment, pick up the phone and call. Everyone should be reachable. It might take a little extra effort, but if in doubt, call. Don't rely on an email. And we have a certain way of operating. We've got a very tenured team. Being alert to, are you being asked to operate in a way that really is fundamentally different than you might have operated in the past, or you get a request that really differs from the way you've gotten a similar request in the past. We've just encouraged people to stay very, very vigilant on that and connect with us in real time to confirm that the instruction's real. But I think fraud is always a risk. And again, I think bad actors will exploit any opportunity, any weakness, any distraction to try to benefit. And I think that's the environment we find ourselves in, unfortunately, as part of this challenge.
Thanks, Eric. Anything you'd add, Bill, as far as what finance and accounting teams should be doing to protect themselves?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of areas to look at, and one of them I think is fairly basic, but I think it's important for organizations to look at and to be thinking about in this environment and going forward. The first is you take the time to review policies, procedures, and make sure all of those things are up to date when you think about authorized users, processes for segregation of duties. If you're using payment or invoice technology, making sure that you have the right contacts and authorized users on that technology technology is incredibly important because, it really makes sure that the organization that you're working with, your technology provider, knows, who can contact them, who can ask questions, and that really helps you have a partner in, working through issues that could be fraudulent in areas like, BEC or phishing or account takeover. I think the other piece too is, going back to, kind of technology themes, it's really important to, when you think about financial processes to, ensure that technology is at the, security is at the core of that technology, and it's leveraging things like multi-factor authentication to, prevent account takeover or user access takeover, using technology to help with identity validation to make sure that where people are logging in or who is logging in is fit for purpose, if you will. And then I also think, and things that we do at Bottom Line within our technology is having suspicious monitoring of activity. We do things, for example, where we're monitoring payment activity to look for trends or flags that are out of the norm. We're taking and interrogating information on invoices that we're receiving on the behalf of customers and understanding, has that invoice came from that email address before? And if it hasn't, that's a red flag for us. So I think, just from a finance operations standpoint, looking at some of the basic things that you can do, but then also looking at technology and really creating kind of multi-layers around security so that, as the fraudsters are trying to, leverage this situation or just in the future, you really have a strong, kind of fortress-like approach to, protecting your financial operations.
Yeah, some great tips and ways technology can be leveraged to improve security there, Bill. Thanks for that. Eric mentioned earlier that, certainly businesses will look at their continuity planning much differently in the future, and it certainly seems like security will be a key component of that, payment security specifically. So to wrap here today, and keeping with the theme of looking forward, if you were to each think about 30 days from now and maybe even 6 months from now, what will life look like for finance and accounting teams, and what advice might you have for them? Is there anything you'd add above and beyond what you've shared today? Maybe we can start with Bill.
Yeah, Eric made a good point earlier about not really knowing what the new normal will be when we come out of this situation. I also don't necessarily think I can predict the future of exactly what organizations should expect, but I do think it goes back to just organizations continuously looking at how are they operating, understanding their business continuity plans, and then really looking and challenging how they're leveraging technology to support their employees and their partners, and making sure that they're thinking about all of the different operating environments that they might be in. An example for me is mobile, and Eric talked about the fact that a lot of his organization traditionally was in the office, and so as they evaluated technology, mobile might not have been something that they had top of mind. I think that's going to change, right? So I think, as we look forward and as organizations look at technology, I think they need to look at it through a different lens of whether it's, better suited to support different work environments. I think it's also really important that, organizations look at technology that suits a purpose for today, but is also, scalable and flexible to help them, operate in, leveraging new payment technologies. For example, we've heard, some of the questions about, how could I more easily adopt a faster payment model? I need to move money to my suppliers quicker. And so, making sure that as you're looking at, technology and processes, it gives you the ability to be able to pivot and react and, adopt the new solutions that could really help you with your operations, but also your suppliers' operations.
Thanks, Bill. Any final thoughts from you, Eric?
When we talk about digital payments or digital solutions to facilitate the payment process, one thing we didn't really talk about, when you asked me to pause on what the next 30 days going as far as 6 months might look like. I think one of the key metrics that just every company, regardless of industry, will be focused on is cash flow broadly, inbound and outbound. And as much as the ability to continue to make payments or receive payments is of course vital, I think technologies that can enable or enhance an organization's ability to provide visibility into their supply chain so that vendors know when they're going to get paid, or provide visibility through their receivables platforms to know when they can themselves expect payment. One person's receivable is another person's payable, of course. I think that type of technology will become increasingly valuable. The natural reaction to the challenge we're in is that cash flow is going to start to be delayed. Companies will push payables, which will, of course, affect someone's receivables position. It's just going to be a cyclical, I believe, reality that will take some time to return to normal. So technologies that can enable not only the certainty of payment, but also visibility into when that payment is scheduled to occur, to alleviate some of the anxiety, to alleviate some of the uncertainty, I think will be very, very valuable.
Thanks, Eric. Really appreciate the insights from both of you for being part of this conversation. From everyone at Bottom Line, we hope our listeners are staying well, and we're here to help with any questions that you might have about how to make AP operations work better during this time. Thanks.
Thank you, Andrea.
Thanks.